Hi everyone, my name is Jenny Aker. I'm an Associate Professor of Development Economics at the Fletcher School at Tufts University. And the purpose of this very brief presentation is to summarize some research that I did in collaboration with Concern Worldwide, looking at the impacts of cash transfers as compared with in-kind transfers in Eastern DRC. Now, the big question that we were trying to address in the context of this research was basically how should society as a whole redistribute wealth to the world's poor? Should it be cash transfers, whether unconditional or conditional, vouchers, which are like near cash, or actual distributions of food aid, medicines, and agricultural inputs? And despite the fact that since the 1990s, cash transfer programs have become an increasingly important part of many of these social protection programs, a majority of social protection programs in many countries are still in kind. Now, economic theory predicts that a program recipient, if given the choice between a cash transfer and an in-kind transfer of equal value, would weakly prefer the cash transfer. If that's the case, then why would NGOs and governments prefer to give in-kind transfers to these populations? Well, there can be a lot of good reasons for that. That might be related to targeting, political feasibility, limited supply on local markets, or potentially program objectives that might be better served by using in-kind transfers. And so how we tried to answer this question was in the context of Eastern DRC. So many of you who know Eastern DRC, it's one of the largest countries in sub-Saharan Africa. It has vast natural resources, but since the 1990s, it's been at the center of what's been termed Africa's World War. There have been millions displaced, millions killed, and despite the fact that there was a peace deal in 2003, there were about 1.7 million IDPs in 2011 and 2012. Now, these IDPs often live in both informal and formal camps. This is an example of an informal camp here. And many of them traditionally have been provided with support from NGOs in the international community, like a social protection program. This has traditionally taken the form of an in-kind transfer, an actual distribution of food aid, medicines, or inputs, or non-food items, or vouchers where people were provided with a type of coupon, like a food stamp that allows them to exchange that coupons for goods and services. Now, working with Concern Worldwide, traditionally, who had been implementing many of these programs as in-kind transfers, they asked the question, does it need to be an in-kind transfer? What would happen if we actually provided a cash transfer to these IDPs? And so that was really the research question that we were trying to address. What are the relative effects if we compare side by side of these different transfer modalities, cash as compared with in-kind, on household purchases, well-being, and other types of costs? This links up to a growing body of research in this area that are comparing cash and in-kind transfers side by side. We did this in the context of a randomized controlled trial in Eastern DRC, and then we not only look at potentially the benefits, but the costs as well. So what did these interventions actually look like? Well, they were implemented by Concern Worldwide in an informal camp in Eastern DRC that had a number of internally displaced persons, or IDPs. The IDPs were provided with $130 over 3 installments between 2011 and 2012, and basically it was intended to increase their assets but also give them access to food items. Because the 500 households in the camp were all equally eligible for some type of support, whether it was cash or a voucher program, we randomly assigned them to one of two modalities. The first one was the unconditional cash transfer, which was new for Concern, which were these cash transfers provided over 3 installments. And the second one was the voucher program, which is what Concern had traditionally been using, which was basically where people got a coupon during the first fair. They could use that coupon to purchase a wide variety of food and non-food items, including school feeds, and during the second and third installments, it could only be used for food items. And the way in which this voucher fair worked, if you're not familiar with it, is that individuals received a coupon that looked very much like this. On the day of the fair, they went to the fair, which had a number of vendors, and they used that coupon and exchanged it at different vendors for food and non-food items for the first one, and just food items for the second one. So how is this different from some other voucher programs that you might have heard about? Well, obviously there are two main differences. One is timing. You could only use it on that one day. And the second one was location. You could only use it at that voucher fair. So this constrained your choices somewhat. Why would we expect any differences in behavior, purchasing, or well-being between these two groups? Well, obviously cash is quite flexible. It's very fungible. It can pretty much be spent on anything, whereas the vouchers were really constrained in terms of when and where it could be spent. If the value of these vouchers were what we call extra marginal, so it was more than what households would have normally have spent on food, then they would have changed their purchasing behavior in order to use the full value of the voucher at that fair. So if I normally spend $20 on food and you give me $40, I would spend a total of $40 on food during that day in order to use the full value of the voucher. And so if that's actually the case in this context, then we would see that purchasing behavior would actually change between the two groups. So we looked at kind of the impact of these different modalities on three things: what people were purchasing, measures of well-being, and costs, both to the program and to the program recipients. What we saw in terms of household purchases, where you see green here in terms of cash and blue in terms of the vouchers, is that the cash households basically used this transfer to purchase about 5 different types of food and non-food items. And you see all of the categories here along the x-axis that include things like school fees, medicines, and reimbursing their debts, some of which the voucher households couldn't actually spend on. That being said, the voucher households were more likely to purchase 3 types of things: salt, dried fish, and rice. Now, were these households so different from before the program that they had a predisposition towards these 3 things? Not necessarily. And what we saw is that not only were they more likely to purchase these things, they purchased more of them. In fact, if you just focus on salt, voucher households bought about 6 times more salt than the cash households, which seems kind of quite surprising on the surface. It's not so surprising when you really think of why. Remember what we said previously. Households in the voucher group had to spend the entire value of the food voucher at the fair on that day, which meant that they were shifting their expenses towards things that were easy to store or easy to resell, and in order to use the full value of the voucher. That being said, their purchasing decisions were still constrained. They couldn't necessarily purchase it on everything that they wanted to. People said that maybe they wanted to buy 2 boxes of salt, but they couldn't carry them both, so they bought 1 box of salt and other things. Now, did these very different purchasing behaviors lead to differences in well-being? We looked at several different types of metrics: food security, asset ownership, agricultural assets, coping strategies, and basically found that despite the fact that purchasing behavior was quite different between the cash and the voucher households, along these metrics of well-being, there were no differences between the two. So very different purchasing behavior, but no differences in well-being. Why do we see no differences in well-being? Well, 2 things were going on here. One, the voucher households were able to resell some of the goods, the salt, the dried fish, and the rice that they had purchased at the voucher fair, use that cash to purchase other things, and two of the 2 groups were actually sharing with each other. So what that meant is that their well-being was similar after the program, even though their purchasing behavior was quite different. Now, what did this mean in terms of costs to the implementing agency concerned worldwide? Well, you see here that the cost for implementing the voucher program was about $16. Much of that staff costs for setting up the vouchers, printing the vouchers, organizing the fair, as compared to the cash program, which is about $3 less per program recipient. So it was cheaper to implement the cash transfer program as compared with the voucher program. So what do we conclude by looking at this context of a small sample in Eastern DRC? Well, first, as I said previously, these 2 different types of groups had very different purchasing behavior, but they had very different similar levels of well-being. Since well-being was the same and cash was much cheaper to implement, then cash would really be the preferred modality here. But that's mainly because goods and services were available in these local markets, so cash was actually something that was possible to use. And a lot of the body of evidence in this space suggests that cash is overall more flexible, which is unsurprising, but vouchers in some cases can actually help to achieve certain objectives, food security, nutrition objectives, which is not necessarily what we saw in the context of this research. But which one you're going to use really depends on targeting, program objectives, local supply, and political feasibility. So if you're interested in more of the details of this paper, please feel free to read it online or in the journal, and contact me if you have any questions. Thanks so much.